Hi, I'm Colin Caesar, an MHS School Committee representative, and welcome to Inside Melrose Public Schools. Our first episode is school funding: who, what, where, how, and why. Joining us today are Superintendent of Melrose Public Schools, Sydney Tamor, and member of the school committee, Ed O'Connell. Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
So the first question I have for you guys is pretty basic. How are the Melrose schools funded?
So the Melrose schools are funded primarily through the city's property tax. Because Melrose is a highly residential city with very little commercial or industrial development, basically all the homeowners are funding. We do have some outside funding from the state, from the federal government, from grants.
But it's a matter of fact that in terms of our state aid, at least, it is diminished over time, such that state aid to the city of Melrose is $1 million less than it was 10 years ago. And certainly state aid in support of our schools as a proportion of our budget has gone down steadily over the years. As the superintendent suggests, federal aid is virtually non-existent. What we have is limited. It's not a matter of the federal government saying, here's $3 million, do your best with it. Any federal money we receive goes directly into federally mandated services.
So the federal funds that we do receive in the schools are mainly what's referred to as title grants. They're used to help students who may be disadvantaged because of economic situations or because of language, not speaking English as a first language, and the use of those funds is very controlled. So they do not go to the total school budget, but we do use them to offset services to students who qualify for the title grants. You'll hear the word offset a lot when we talk about the budget. So what'll happen is we have a number of other funding sources for the schools. As you all know, your activities fees, things like that. Some other grants that we receive, the METCO grant, the STEP grant through MAV. All those are used to offset some of the work we do. Approximately $4.9 million worth of grants and other funding sources, but the bulk of our funds, approximately $28 million, comes from the city.
And the lion's share of that money comes from our property taxes, as the superintendent has stated. So it's an important factor. And in an era of lean municipal budgets and particularly lean school budgets, and an era when state aid is declining and federal aid is already allocated to direct services, then we have to look to city support for the schools. And ultimately that means our property taxes.
So you mentioned the various different sources of the income for the schools. How much does the city contribute compared to the state? And you mentioned federal as well. How does that add up?
So this year's school budget is $32,590,242. Of that, $27,596,824 came from the city. Okay? So really, the majority of our money comes from the city. Among the other funding sources is, what happens is you get what's called Chapter 70 money from the state. It's calculated based on how many students we have and categories those students may fall into. So we get a little bit more, say, for a student who is special education or an English language learner. We also get billed for the money we owe the charter school for the students who go to the charter school. So at the end of the day, our Chapter 70 money netted out at approximately $26,000. The bulk of it went to our charter payment. So again, even though you may get money on paper, you sometimes don't realize that money in actual dollars. So it's a little bit complicated for people to understand. But at the end of the day, we are not getting a lot of funding from the state. Part of the issue for us is we're a fairly successful city. Our parents are hardworking, educated. While we do have some students and families who need state assistance, we don't have it to the degree in which we would be getting a large amount of state or federal supplemental funding. So that is a problem for Melrose.
So what sort of factors would lead to the state providing more money to the city for schools?
Well, one thing that would make a difference is if the state ever managed to fix the school funding formula statewide. Right. It's understood by all that the formula by which the state funds public schools is outdated and broken on a number of fronts. And there was legislation moved forward to address that, but not in full. So that's a significant factor that negatively affects how much state aid we receive. And it's understood that statewide, as a result of those shortcomings with the state's school funding formula, we're shortchanging schools to the tune of $1 billion statewide. That has an effect not just in Melrose, but everywhere. And in some cities and towns much more significantly than in Melrose.
So because of cuts and deficits and lack of money, sort of like that, what sort of cuts, especially this most recent year, were made to the school budget, and what effect did that have on practical student daily life?
So, as you know, one of the problems we have is growing enrollment. It's a great problem to have. It says wonderful things about the school district, that people want to live here and send their children to school here. We've had a number of students return from private, parochial, and charter, which is a great compliment to us. However, we have not been able to increase our teaching staff to the degree we need to. This building, the high school, is certainly understaffed. We cut 4 teachers at the elementary school. At the middle school. We were able to do that because we have a slight dip in enrollment at the middle school while we have growth in enrollment at the 2 ends of the spectrum. We've had to add teachers to the elementary school because our kindergartens have been growing so much. When I first came here, I think we had 13 classes each grade. This K, I have 16 classes each grade. This high school is over 1,000 students now. A couple of years ago, it was probably in the 875 range. So we're having tremendous growth, and for that we need teaching staff. We were not able to add the amount of teaching staff that we wanted to add. We cut all our supply budgets very lean. We chose not to purchase some new materials. If you look at our art budget, we reduced, we figure per pupil, we reduced that per pupil, how much art supplies our art teachers have. Those are the type of things that we had to cut. We cut stuff that you kids typically don't see, professional development, office supplies. I'm down a secretary in administration because our primary goal is to try to keep as many teachers as possible so that our class size is manageable.
The fact is we cut over $1 million from the superintendent's proposed budget for this school year. And your question is a good one. What is the impact on students' day-to-day lives? We tend to talk about the big ticket items, losing 4 teachers at the middle school, changing the configuration of our middle school. But as the superintendent said, we cut $10,000 in supplies, general supplies, to the high school. We cut art, music supplies at all of our schools. Tech ed supplies at the middle school. We deferred the purchase of some $60,000 worth of textbooks at the high school. Those were planned purchases. And we can't continue to grow our school district and be the best we can be and provide the best education for our students when we're making those kinds of cuts that directly impact your day-to-day experience in the schools.
So with those cuts, you mentioned the lack of, or the reduction of some middle school teachers. How well are our teachers compensated for their work compared to other cities and towns, especially in the area?
So again, it's a good question, Conlon. I would say that when I look at, say, the SEAM Collaborative to which we belong, which includes Wakefield, Stoneham, Saugus, Linfield, North Reading, Wilmington, or I look at the Middlesex League, to which we play sports, which includes many of those same cities, plus Arlington, Lexington, Burlington. We are in the lower 50 percentile, maybe closer to the lower 30 percentile when you compare what we pay. Our salaries for the first 5 years a teacher works is pretty comparative. Where we're not as competitive or as we should be is as you get past your first 5 years and you become a more senior teacher. That's the area of greatest concern in our contract right now.
In many ways, it's comparing apples to oranges. Each school district is different. And clearly, while we don't pay our teachers as well as some districts, teachers are coming to this district. And they're coming here because we provide great professional development opportunities, because we have great leadership in our schools, and we provide leadership opportunities for educators within our schools. So there's a lot that attracts educators to Melrose. But as the superintendent points out, we don't pay our teachers as well as we might. As has been reported, our average teacher salary in Melrose is on the order of $65,000 a year. That's far below the statewide average of $78,000 a year. And in fact, our average teacher salary is among the lowest in the state. It's in the bottom 20% statewide. I know the superintendent was referring to regionally. But one, has to wonder what it takes to get teachers to come here, and as the superintendent rightly points out, stay here. That's the real issue. When Stoneham, the average salary is $72,000, Saugus at $73,000, Wakefield is $74,000, all the way up to Winchester being $76,000, Malden is $84,000 a year. So we need to do a better job at creating a salary structure that not only brings people in, but keeps them and rewards them for the good work that they do.
So with all that brought into mind, how does the Proposition 2.5 override factor into what we've discussed? Like a simple overview of what the override is and how it might affect the schools.
It's the one funding source that we as a community have control over. Again, federal aid is committed. State aid is declining. Other revenues are static at best. Meanwhile, our expenses go up and up and up. Expenses over which we have little, if any, control. So what we do have control over as a community is our property taxes. And it's a significant factor in funding our schools. And communities, Reading most recently in our local area, passed a property tax override this past year to increase support and funding for their schools. Mayor Gail Inferna, our mayor here in Melrose, has stated that a property tax override is in order in Melrose, particularly given the cuts we had to make to the school budget last year. What that override will do is increase the amount of property taxes that we have, revenues that we have available to support our schools.
So do you understand? So by Massachusetts state law, dating back to 1980, is it already? We can only raise our property taxes 2.5% every year. That's where the number comes from. Okay? So if you want to go above that, you have to put the question out to the voters. Are they willing to go above the 2.5%? So we're not asking for 2.5%. That we can do. We're asking to go above it. And we're trying to calculate a number that's reasonable, that is affordable for most residents, and yet will meet a lot of our needs going forward. But as Mr. O'Connell said, two things have happened. Years ago, they brought in 2.5 following Proposition 13 in California because there was a feeling that Massachusetts residents were taxed too heavily. In '93, they created the school foundation budget formula, which calculated this is how much money you need to give every child an adequate education. Not a fabulous education, but an adequate education. And that was an equity issue because cities and towns had such great disparity in '93. When they calculated that formula, nobody could foresee what would happen with costs. The two biggest factors that have impacted school budgets are health costs, health insurance. I'm sure you all hear that. It's a national debate. Special education costs. And that has put the formula out of whack. So there's a couple of things that need to happen in the state really to make schools secure in their funding. As Mr. O'Connell said, the Foundation Budget Review Commission from the state has recommended increases to state funding of over $1 billion over the next several years. But even with that, because Melrose is not the type of city that is going to receive a lot of additional state or federal funding, it will be on us to create the type of funding sources we need to create the school system we want for our students. And that's where 2.5 comes in.
And in a community like Melrose, with a limited commercial tax base and limited new growth, in many ways it's perfectly natural and appropriate to look to the override provisions of Proposition 2.5 to increase the amount of tax revenues available to support our schools and other city services. When we talk about Proposition 2.5, we tend to focus on the limit, on the cap, naturally. But clearly, from 1980, from the inception of this law, there has been provision in the law by which cities and towns can override the 2.5% cap and thereby increase support for city services and schools.
I think another important aspect for people to understand is districts are guaranteed a certain amount of money. You have what is called net school spending. It is a number the city must give us. If they don't give us that amount of money, there is a penalty for the city. They can't set their tax rate. There's other things that can't happen. So sometimes it means taking from Peter to give to Paul. And what happened this year's budget, in order to help fund the schools, the city made a decision to take $75,000 from DPW and give it to the school budget in order to make their obligation to the school budget. That becomes a problem because if he doesn't have it, that impacts what? Trash pickup, plowing, cutting grass around the city, fixing roads. So people have to understand that it's really a total picture. That if you solve the school problem, you're probably freeing up money for other sources in the city that need it as well.
And it's important to say that schools in every city and town, not just Melrose, are an important part of the local economy, in many ways a driver of the local economy, and certainly an important factor, if not the most important factor, in the quality of life in any community, particularly Melrose. So I think, you know, from an economic standpoint, it's always wise to invest in one's schools. And there's also, you know, beyond the economics of it, there's a matter of responsibility. And the fact of the matter is, the Melrose Public Schools don't belong to Superintendent Tamor. They don't belong to me. They don't belong to the school committee. They belong to the public. These are public schools. So part of any discussion about support for our schools, whether by override or otherwise, has to take into account, I think, that the schools are a matter of public responsibility. And I think the superintendent and I and my colleagues in the school committee have made the case that they are worthy of investment. We will continue to do that.
So you mentioned the override and the propositions. What is the difference between an override and a debt exclusion?
A debt exclusion, so let me back up. There's 3 buckets of money in a city. There's the operating budget. There's debt that the city borrows for and pays interest and principal for, and that's part of the operating budget. So if I buy a car, I have to figure my household budget to cover the costs of buying that car. So that's regular debt. And then there's debt exclusion for big projects. So when the middle school was built, that's a debt exclusion. So you go forth to the public and you put forth a proposal that we need $20 million to build a school, and over 20 years your tax rate will go up X number of dollars, and when the 20 years is over and the debt is paid, it comes off the tax rate. So that's basically the difference between an override and a debt exclusion. A debt exclusion will eventually come off the tax rate. An override permanently raises the benchmark on the tax rate.
Cool. Well, thank you for explaining that. For the next portion of the show, we were able to ask some students from the U.S. Government and Politics class, Mr. Daly's AP class. We asked them what they wanted to ask you guys. So I have a couple questions here. Our first one is, what practical changes should the high school students expect to see if the override takes effect?
The most important thing that I will be asking for in the override is more teachers, okay? More classroom teachers, another guidance counselor. I think those are all things that you need immediately. We will also be asking in the override is for sufficient funding for retention of our current teaching staff. But that is not something you will necessarily see as a student. You may feel it, but you will not necessarily see it. We will also ask for money in the override to purchase the things we have not been able to purchase. One of the problems with having a growing enrollment is you need more materials, you need more technology, you need more books, so we need to account for that and buy those materials that we need. We're also hoping that if the override stabilizes the school budget to a point where we feel that we're paying for the necessities, we can then pay attention to some other areas we need to pay attention to. Activities fees, additional personnel for coverage in the building, those type of things. But my primary goal, as the mayor tries to say, is students, space, and staffing. That is the focus, students, space, and staffing. And then once that's all taken care of, we can begin to work our way through some other things that we need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. You know, more teachers at the high school, and additional smaller class sizes as a result, an additional guidance counselor. Resources, more resources available to support not just student success, but student social and emotional well-being.
You mentioned earlier that, especially at the beginning and end of the K-12 spectrum, there's big growth in the high school and elementary schools. What are some of the short-term and longer-term plans that you have in effect to account for those?
Well, let me kick off on this one. This has been a topic of a great deal of discussion, not just at the school committee meetings, but also among members of the public, and rightly so. We've done a lot. You know, we continue to look at this. I think we have 2 more demographic studies that are going to be coming online shortly. We created 2 new kindergarten classrooms at the Franklin Early Childhood Center. We created new modular classrooms at the Hoover School and the Winthrop School. We renovated the Horace Mann School. It's something that we are always looking at. And we're well aware that this enrollment wave, if you will, while it's now hitting our lower grades, will come up through the schools. And I think an important thing that we'll continue to keep an eye on is the impact on the high school, because that wave is coming here. And I think it's fair to say that we're fairly pressed for space right now at the high school. And what is now a concern will become a problem in the years ahead if we don't address that. So we're going to have to come to terms with that. I think all options are on the table, as they always are. I think the superintendent and our city government and our school committee, if I may say, has been appropriately creative in addressing our space needs. We will continue to do that.
So the interesting arrangement in Melrose is, while the school committee owns our buildings, the Department of Public Works manages them. And I've had a great partner in the Department of Public Works, and for 6 years we've been carving out space wherever we can carve out space. We've taken rooms at the elementary school and have divided them in half so that we can have rooms for special education and English as a second language. You know, on the 3rd floor here we carved a room in half. When we did the build out here to create the learning commons and the new makerspace and the new offices on the first floor, we emptied spaces on the second and third floor that can be recaptured for space with some minor construction. We look at other spaces in the building that we could think about differently by moving the music program over to the middle school, which was a good move because, first of all, that room is acoustically appropriate for a music program. It gave us the big rooms up here that we've recaptured. So we've done a lot of shuffling and carving out space where we can. The problem comes when do we reach a point where that's not sufficient anymore and we have to look at other options. And we're constantly looking at that.
So you mentioned sort of shuffling around some people in the music departments. How do staffing decisions such as the music teachers, or how does that affect, I'm just going to start that again. You mentioned that some programs were moved around to different schools or maybe sharing some resources such as the music program. How would staffing, or shared staffing rather, at one building and to another building, how does that affect schedules of each building respectively?
Well, anytime we have staff share between buildings, and music is a good example, I think. Physical education teachers are another. There's going to have to be coordination of schedules between the buildings. The fact of the matter is we don't have the financial resources to have a music teacher in every school or a physical education teacher assigned to every elementary school. There's going to have to be sharing, and when there's sharing and there's staff moving between buildings, there are going to be scheduling impacts. But we managed to coordinate it all.
And one of the things that we've done slowly over the past 4 years, as you know up here, is we've gotten these two buildings on the same schedule. And that has been very important to us. It's been important so we can maximize the use of staff. It's also been important so that we can give a lot of opportunities to students moving between the buildings. As you know, there are middle school kids who come over here for Algebra 1, for Latin, the music, and some of the art students go over there. We created the furniture course over there so that you can go over there and use the occupational ed space that they have there that you don't have over here. So getting these two buildings on the same schedule has allowed us to be more effective and efficient in sharing staff. The problem becomes, again, the numbers of staff as the numbers grow. As we now know, we have approximately 65 seniors, you may be among them, who come in a little late every morning, so you don't have to take an A block. We have about 200 kids in AP Lab. Those are not ideal solutions, but those are solutions that are made because of the lack of staffing.
And as with any problems, and you've been great about this, Superintendent, anytime we have an issue or a challenge or a problem, we manage to find the opportunity in that. And the staffing challenges at the middle school and high school and the space challenges have presented us with an opportunity to develop this unified campus. And as the superintendent says, to provide these wonderful opportunities for younger students to interact with not only students at the high school, but educators at the high school. And we've also been very fortunate to have administrators and teachers, educators, one and all, committed to the notion of a shared campus and supportive of that. And in particular, Mr. Merrill at the high school and Mr. Parsons at the middle school. They believe in this. And again, we recognize that it's one of many challenges, but it's also an opportunity, and we've seized that opportunity, I think.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us. Again, this is Ms. Taymor and Mr. O'Connell. Thank you for joining us and answering our questions. I will see you next time on Inside Melrose Public Schools.